Hello, everyone. I'm Donna Hawley, the president of the Investment Institute, and on behalf of Andrea Zigothy and myself, we welcome you to the fourth session of our virtual coffee break series. For those of you joining in for the first time and who may not know us, TII provides non-commercial investment educational forums, usually in person, twice a year for those that subscribe to our membership. Through the years, we have built a sophisticated membership community of endowments, foundations, pensions, family offices, consultants, and asset management firms. Since the pandemic, we've shifted to a more virtual platform for now to keep our members as connected as possible and to continue to offer education from some of our wonderful speakers. Andrea will speak further about some exciting new things we have on our schedule for the upcoming year, for the end of the year and for next year, so stay tuned at the end for those announcements. Today, we are so honored to be featuring Georg Kell, who will be sharing his insights with us about lessons to be learned from this global pandemic. Georg is the founding executive director of United Nations Global Compact and the chairman of Arabesque. We are also very grateful to have our dear friend and longtime member of our editorial committee, Libby Georg, with us today. Libby is the director of investments at NC State University and will be moderating some questions of her own, as well as those from all of you, with Georg following his 20-minute presentation. Please take a moment now to locate the Q&A button on your Zoom screens, and we encourage you to type your questions in as soon as you have them. Don't wait until the Q&A portion of the session. Type them in as soon as you have them so that Libby can take some time to review them, and we'll do our best to cover as many as we can during the session. Andrea and I thank you all so much for being here. We look forward to being in person with you all again soon, but thank you for joining us virtually in the meantime. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it off to Georg Kell. Thank you, Georg.
Thank you, Donna. And thank you to the Investment Institute for hosting me on this wonderful occasion on this humid afternoon here in New York City. What I want to do in 20 minutes is share with you my interpretation on what it means, the changes that are happening around us and what it means now and for the future. I had the privilege of observing global affairs for many years with former Secretary General Kofi Annan and others, and I hope that these perspectives add some interesting dimensions. The first question I think I would suggest is to step back from day-to-day events and to reflect on what does this all mean. And I think we will soon conclude that we are in an era where change is indeed happening ever faster. Already before the pandemic, we all noted how technological change is increasingly disrupting. We learned to come to grips with exponential changes in certain industry sectors, how disruptive they can be. Now added to that, the health crisis, which has unleashed many forces in societies and reactions. COVID-19 is not only a health crisis, it has pulled the curtain away from societies. It shows how effective governments are, public sectors are in dealing with the health crisis, but it also shines a light on some of the fault lines within societies. And that explains obviously also why the current movement that against racism, you can argue, is an outcome of that. I predict that many more of such similar events will happen actually in the future. We do live in a time of rapid change. We have to adjust our business models to the changing frameworks. And from a strategic angle, it means coming to grips with uncertainty, investing more in preparedness, investing more in innovation and flexible adaptability. No organization, no institution, whether public or private, can escape that. So that's kind of a big picture, very general analysis. Now, nobody can predict the future, obviously, and unfortunately, often we don't learn from the past either. But in this particular time where we are now, there are obviously very important questions, open questions ahead of us. The most important one immediately is obviously, when will a vaccine be available? How deep and long will the recession be? And how will the recovery look like? And we all follow developments as they unfold. We all follow these very important short-term signals that clearly are fundamentally important. But beyond that, I suggest there are three other big questions that are also open, looming big beyond those. The first one is, will the crisis fuel more strategic rivalry? Will we accelerate our move away from a rule-based global system? Will the future be even messier and chaotic? Or will governments at some point rediscover rule-based integration as a pillar for peace and security and prosperity? Very fundamentally important. Obviously, the US-China relationship is at the core of that, but it's not the only big issue. Remember, over 50% of global GDP today is produced by autocratic systems already. So we're talking here not just of one country, but we're talking of a whole new wave of economic activities done under centralized, often dictatorial paradigms. And how will that play out? Open question. The second one is obviously the pandemic is only now gathering momentum in many emerging markets with high population densities. And we can actually assume that many humanitarian crisis situations will emerge in all likelihood. Many governments there just don't measure the disease, they ignore it, but the bodies are piling up, it can't be hidden. And easily other bigger disruptions can happen, food supply, social unrest. So more is to come, most likely, in that space, much more. And the third big open question is the huge government stimuli now being employed everywhere, over 10 trillion US dollars. It means governments are back in the game. In some countries, we have state ownership of strategic corporations. And that means also the future will be more government shaped than the past was, than we were used to. Some people already reflect on, is the Reagan era coming to an end, question mark. But irrespective of that, I think the other important aspect is, will the current stimuli packages lead to a business as usual and thereby arguably fuel the next crisis, the climate crisis, or will governments be smart enough to respond to the current crisis by building more resilient outcomes that are friendlier for the future and better future fit? Open question. Currently, we see a divergence, for example, between the US and Europe, but over time, one may argue that may converge as well again. But very fundamentally important. COVID-19 is indeed one of those big mega events that is history defining. We will talk about the time before and after COVID. It falls into the category like 9/11 was a dividing historical moment which reshaped the world. The financial crisis was another one. So that is kind of a big, very big picture take on it. Now, specifically, what lessons can we learn already when you step back? And I would argue there are at least 4 lessons we can learn. One is we have to understand vulnerabilities of our systems, and we have to accept that man-made, human-made systems are embedded in a wider context that is not only the society and the regulatory environment, but it's also the natural environment. In being embedded within a bigger planetary boundary, if you so want, is a whole different ballgame. We have to start to understand the meaning of that. We do need over time a new relationship with our boundary conditions, because the natural boundaries are stressed to the limits already. We know from scientists, we know from figures, we know from events. So we have to really change course on that angle. We have to understand that markets are not isolated, they are part of society, and both markets and people are part of the planet. And as the human impact on the natural environment has become a geophysical force, where the footprint is so immense, we increasingly feel the feedback on our very foundations. So we have to come to grips with that. Basically, we need a whole different valuation system to appreciate that and to re-steer. In principle, we know what should be done, but the will obviously is nowhere there yet. And this is a societal challenge. You cannot just point the finger at one actor alone. The second lesson is a very trivial, and probably your mother told you already, at least mine told me, prevention is better than cure. It's an old saying, but there's truth behind it. And if only we were prepared better, we would be off so much better whenever crisis hits. It's a tragedy of humanity that our own phlegma and our biases against unquantifiable uncertainties prevents us often from doing the right thing. But the crisis has been shaking us up. I think long-term risk perceptions are changing now. we now understand that uncertainty, even if we cannot yet measure it in terms of price signals, is something we should take very, very seriously. And one positive trend I like to stress here is the role of science is obviously very fundamental, and the COVID-19 has elevated the role of science all over the world. And I believe that is a good thing, because science is a more neutral arbitrator for debates, and we should listen and learn to listen to science much more. I would suggest that as a second kind of general lesson. The third one, a tricky one, global threats need global responses. No country is safe when the virus is not contained everywhere. The virus will find its way, maybe slower, on foot or through birds or otherwise, but we have to be aware we are in the same boat and we need to collaborate in fighting global threats. My former boss, the late Kofi Annan, one of the greatest diplomats ever, he talked of problems without passports. And as we are interconnected on this globe, we have to realize that we have to tackle global challenges together, and we have to put everything else aside and work together. Really, really important. Climate change is a global thing, like the virus, like health threats, like terrorism, cybersecurity, all the ills, drug trafficking, all the isms. So it implies a call for greater collaboration. The fourth lesson is probably not really a lesson, but an observation. In times where arguably some policy leaders fail their people, one can argue, the role of the private sector is even more important as a stopgap filler, but also as a building block to give direction for future developments. And that's where I'm so delighted that the private sector, I would argue business was first, now finance is switching on, have long started a journey of changing business models over the past 20 years in many incremental steps: supply chains, human resource management, internalization of externalities, measurement of emissions, and hundreds and thousands of more examples: human rights, non-discrimination, gender empowerment. Many movements have made many progresses in small steps over 20 years. And these small steps actually add up to quite a big change in business models. A well-functioning modern corporation today is very different from a corporation 20 years ago. In my interpretation, we are talking here of nothing else but a huge transformation from the industrial era mindset, where scale and scope, cost minimization was the only paradigm, to a new model of, some people call it stakeholder capitalism, some call it aware, sensitive capitalism. I think we don't know yet what to call it, but we know some of the features already. It's more digital, it's smarter, it's cleaner, and it's more people related and people driven. And these are very deep functional criteria which can increasingly be measured and quantified. Now, I talked about this gradual change of the corporate world, and we have seen in the past 2-3 weeks a number of public advocacy by corporates urging governments to use the crisis to prepare for the next crisis rather than wasting this crisis. And this to me is very heartening, because it shows that a growing number of corporations really understand the writing on the wall, and they deduct from the lessons from this crisis that the right thing to do now is to double down on their own efforts. And finance has been starting to catch up rapidly. The ESG movement started in 2005. PRI was created in 2006. First progress was slow, but then breakthroughs happened in 2014-15, when the first materiality proof was brought that corporations which are good on the sustainability agenda also are good on valuation. At least they're not worse than those which are not. And this kind of evidence has been coming in more and more. And that's why ESG, sustainable investing, has been on the rise enormously. And in my own mindset, these developments are not only here to stay, but they're truly bound to reshape how markets work. Why? Because the driving forces behind these movements are irreversible. Technological change, digitalization, transparency, is irreversible. Governments can slow it down, but they cannot stop it. It will continue to rise. The issue of natural boundaries and the necessity to come up with a new relationship with the natural environment is here to stay. We cannot undo it. We have almost 10 billion people on this planet. We have a certain living standard, consumption patterns. We will be forced sooner or later to take more drastic actions. It's here to stay. And the third big irreversible force, it's more principle hope, but the young generation is always ready to embrace the future more than the older ones. And so we see how social norms are changing rapidly, habits from healthy food to transportation to ownership concepts. So we have reason to assume that indeed this change agenda will increasingly be supported by the young generation. I'm particularly optimistic that with the progress that is being made on digitalization and the ability to increasingly better quantify what in the past we didn't account for is increasingly becoming part of valuation. I don't want to advocate here particular solutions, but our S-ray methodology, for example, has shown just in the last 3 months that the social dimension in the ESG is now enjoying a premium. And it makes sense because corporations which are good on health and safety, take care of their workers, and invest in a rebound that is based on trust and based on social bonds, obviously are the stronger ones because they have a long-term perspective on this. So there's enormous progress on the digitalization front, and this brings together responsible business with sustainable investment. And as the two are being increasingly connected, we have a whole new playfield for accelerating positive change that leads to better outcome, better social outcomes, better environmental outcomes. So in that regard, I'm very optimistic, very upbeat. There are some other aspects. There are reason to worry: the fragmentation of regulatory environments, the abandonment of global public goods, for example. But I think progress in that sense is irreversible. We are bound to come up with solutions that will drive us forward. And finance has a very, very important role to play. I used to be very cynical about finance as an engineer, and I hardly would talk to bankers. But I realize now that the power of finance, once linked to values, and once those values are better measured and part of the valuation, wow, what a force for good it can be. So, and that is a fairly new trend, a fairly recent one, and a very, very important, a systemic one. I think I'll leave it at that. This was a very general overview of big picture analysis. I'm especially delighted that the protests going on against racism, I think it's a positive sign. It's a very great reaction. It means the human spirits are alive. Universal principles of respect are alive. The same applies to young people pushing for more environmental sustainability. It's a very positive thing. We should look at this with seriousness and recognize that they are the future.
Thank you, George. I appreciate that. That was a great insight and into a lot of the, the things that we have learned from the current pandemic and the crisis, and what we still have yet to learn. To that point, I think one of the 4 lessons that you indicated, we are not on this planet, we are of this planet, in essence. So in the current crisis, basically, you would think it'd be a wake-up call to everyone, right? But why do you think it's so difficult for human beings to change their course? Because we seem to think that, there have been, like when we had previously talked about, there hasn't been large change from the wildfires that are out in California or some of the other crises that have occurred. So why do you think it's so difficult?
Yeah, it's human phlegma. It's habits we learned when we were young. We carry forward. We are creatures of habits, and we have an inbuilt phlegma limit. We only are becoming really creative and innovative once we are forced to do so. So you can argue the disasters that happened so far just weren't big enough to be a big impact. How will COVID reflect in changing social norms is really an interesting question. I know some academics who follow that with keen interest because that shapes behavioral patterns, preference pattern. Some changes will certainly come out of the pandemic. Many of them are technology driven. The fact that we meet here via Zoom is one of them. Yeah? And many corporates will stick with work from home policies, reduced travel, and so forth. It's a very tangible, concrete outcome already. But there may be many others in this domain. But then societies are very diverse too. While we all share similar aspirations, at least I believe so, we all are part of a historical context from where we come from. And the historical context shapes our institutions, our incentive structures, our political structures. And for these structures to change, it takes time. One example, where I grew up in West Germany in those days, in the Cold War peak, and the youth protests there were largely about forcing our old generation to come to grips with the past. And it took 20 years to bring that long march through the institutions, as it is called, to a real impact. So some change takes many, many steps to lead somewhere. Other changes can be very rapid once the impact is really big and there's no choice but to adapt to it. On climate front, I'm afraid we will need even bigger impact before systems are really changing course in a more radical way.
Wow, that's true. What would you say, given all the state-sponsored IP theft and cyber crimes, the prospects of a cooperative global body seem rather unattainable?
Yes, it concerns me very much. I truly regret that collaboration in these spaces has been diminished. It has been nationalized. So the whole understanding of we have public goods we have to protect and to nurture and to take care seems to have gotten lost in many places. That's very regrettable. I think that has to change and will change because ultimately some of these threats are very, very substantive and very serious, and no player alone can solve it. You need collaboration. We will be forced to collaborate. There's no other way. Will it be once we have the wake-up call and we have no other choice, or will it be out of foresight? That is the question. Obviously, the price to be paid once we are forced to do so will be much higher than when we do it out of prevention.
Right, right.
That's the whole dilemma of humanity. You can even sum it up. The state of man hasn't really changed much since we left the caves. That's one interpretation. Another one is, well, the enemy is us, has always been us. We do the biggest damage to ourselves. When will we change? When we look into the mirror, I think we all recognize we are imperfect. So we have a lot of work to do.
So to that point, what would you, if you had to list, say, the top 3 or 4 behavioral changes that you think are imperative for corporations, governments, human beings in general, what will it take? What are those changes that are needed and from a behavioral perspective in order to affect change?
One thing is measuring what we haven't measured so far, because we carelessly do things where we are not aware of the impact of what we're doing. That's why I'm a great supporter of anything that comes with carbon measurement and footprinting. I think it's very, very important. It's the way to start. Yeah? It doesn't mean that people then will understand it fully or act already, but it's creating the knowledge about our impact is a first step, a very important. And it's a long-term educational aspect that is involved with it, often generational one. That's one. The second one is probably more related to governance in general. I think we have to rediscover what is the public good we want to preserve and where we want to invest in. What do we have in common? So it's almost like a soul searching again. What is it in the community? What is it in our wider context we consider really as essential and important? And the COVID crisis, if anything else, it lays open the human dilemma. It shines the light full force on our weaknesses. So rethinking our common interest, very important. And the framework conditions are changing, yes, but we always have to be alert on that front, always rethink. Even if we think we got it once, we have to constantly work on ourselves because we're imperfect, right? So,
right.
why do people go to church every week? You might argue once they got it, no need anymore. No.
Right. Keep on going.
Yeah. And the third one, more on the, that's why I'm optimistic actually. I see this confluence now of strategic investment thinking that is long-term in alignment with long-term corporate strategies. I think it's phenomenal. It's a whole new ball game now. It opens up new opportunities. Almost 1,000 companies worldwide have embraced science-based targets, for example. It's a sophisticated way of measuring your footprint. Yes, disclosure is still imperfect, but the quantification is making enormous progress. Investors are realizing now that the unknown, the tragedy of the horizon aspect, as Mark Carney called it, is for real. And I have a book forthcoming on that, Sustainable Investing. I may advertise briefly. It's a co-edited book with Mark Carney doing the foreword. I think investors are now really waking up on the uncertainty dimension and being prepared. And that's a good thing. We're learning from it. And once investors relocate capital on a massive scale away from the most polluting, most horrible performers to the relatively better ones, we accelerate transformation. Because behind it is arguably a bigger dilemma of humanity, transformation of ourselves and our systems, our economic systems. It's not an easy thing. The industrial era economy has grown over 200 years. We are used to thinking in certain terms, scale, scope, minimize, maximize. Now we are challenged to think in multiple timescales, and we are challenged to think in multiple systems at the same time. And so I feel pretty optimistic about our learning ability to translate this into products, into concrete applications, and thereby accelerate changes.
So how do you get the finance industry, though, to value the externality risk properly and direct capital intentionally when the composition of the industry is monolithic and benefits from not deviating from the status quo?
Well, we are on a learning curve there, but a lot of progress has been made. The world started 20 years ago with sustainability reports and their interpretation. They were backward-looking, static. Now we have SASB, we have the materiality concept. We have increasingly dynamic, updated data that is more forward-looking. So I think the data context has improved enormously, and this allows investors increasingly to distinguish between best-in-class performers and worst-in-class. That's one route approach, but it's a good one. It cuts across all sectors of industries. You can also compare within each industry best worst-class performers. And that is already one benchmark how you can look into long-term. And then, of course, you can look into the crystal ball and outguess where this transformation has the technology winners. We're in the midst of enormously rapidly AI transformation, automation. So clearly the future is going there. So does it mean everything electrified, everything smart, everything connected? Who are the winners? What are the key criteria behind it? So it's a wonderful, wonderful playground for outguessing the future on top of the systematic valuation.
Right. So, you know, there's this part about, you know, okay, the crisis occurred, right? And it has forced us to do many things that we didn't think that were possible. Working at home, being able to continue things from that perspective. So I keep grasping with how do we get the companies and the corporations from a sustainability perspective to sort of carry on that initiative? I mean, the EU has the taxonomy, right? And they came out with a green list that helps guide the corporations as far as along the lines of ESG, disclosure reporting. Do you think we'll ever see the SEC rules guidance, you know, provide that type of guidance for corporate ESG disclosure? I feel that that in some ways, you know, unless you're forced to do something, you're not going to do it, you know.
Well, big corporations are very well connected. They act globally. That's a good thing of it. Many US headquartered companies are very active in Europe and elsewhere. And corporations tend to strive towards best practice models. And a lesson out of the crisis is indeed resilience and innovation and digitalization and decarbonization. I know of many US-based companies which now are doubling down on decarbonization, although it's not mandated, simply because they realize this is the way to go, this is the future. For me, regulation usually catches up with the real trends. It's rarely driving change unless of extreme situations, accidents and so forth. But in this case, I think the business case for decarbonization, for example, increasingly is apparent, especially if you have a medium to long-term time perspective. American companies are among the world's leaders on decarbonization, despite the fact they're not mandated to do so. So I think it has its business case logic, and that's the beauty of this change, that it's irrespective of what governments do. I said recently, and I believe it really to be true, governments can, of course, accelerate this transformation and change, with public procurement, with incentive structures and so forth, and they can slow it down as well, but they cannot stop it. And big corporations are connected, they're globally thinking, globally acting, they devise their strategies based on best practice models, and they want to be future-proof.
So we've talked a lot about, you know, the big corporations. What about the smaller guys? What about the smaller companies? You know, by far the greatest proportion of employees work in the smaller companies.
It's a mixed picture. Many, of course, are in the supply chain of the big ones. So policies of big companies matter. They matter very much. I think the percentage is almost 50%. But many other small companies, actually, many startups now make their living by embracing new values. And you see a huge outburst of creativity going on. Just consider the food sector, for example. The innovations that came out of California is now shaping the policies of the world's largest food company like Nestle, for example. Yeah? And that was bottom-up evolution. You respond to emerging demand, and this is where the social norm change agenda is so important. That's why I think out of the crisis, we can pick up a lot of interesting signals of changing consumer preferences and valuation that feed directly into emerging business models. So there's the creativity, the innovation is happening at the small corporate level.
So basically, what would you say, let's sort of tie all this in, say to, you know, you had mentioned during your talk that you're coming out with a book on sustainable investing. What do you see as some of the potential or the already investment opportunities that have occurred since this pandemic?
We have seen already so far that corporations which are good on ESG performance are on average outperforming companies which are not. And I would be happy to supply some special insight on the social dimension, which actually spiked during the last 4 months, not surprisingly. Companies which just dismissed their workforce, irrespective of health implications, performed relatively badly versus others, and irrespective of sector, by the way, of course. Secondly, I'm also delighted that decarbonization as a strategic tool is now in the boardrooms, firmly anchored in leading companies. And that means a whole new mindset is taking shape, because then the question comes not only what does it mean for our energy supply, but the question is also what does it mean for our supply chains? What does it mean for our products? How do we use or reuse them? So this circular economy thinking is all of a sudden becoming popular again, which is delightful. And it points in the right direction, I would argue.
So what do you think in terms of the asset management industry? You know, it's the least diverse industry, mostly white, conservative men, most of whom do not believe in climate change and think ESG is a passing fancy.
Sorry,
how do you meet The asset management.
Oh,
So how do you meet the need for capital to value externality risk properly if the investment management enablers are not equipped to handle this change?
well, my great CEO would argue, and he wrote a whole chapter in my forthcoming book about it, that the industry is up for radical change anyway. But it's largely AI is increasingly replacing core functions. The other one is sustainability integration is becoming a differentiating factor, which increasingly will matter, especially with the younger population. ESG investing now covers already over $30 trillion, at least in terms of overall approaches. Many of these approaches are just negative screens and are not yet there on the positive side, but it shows there's a fundamental rethink happening. I have no doubt that the industry will adapt to this change, embed externalities increasingly, discover the beauty of digitalization and coming to grips with that. And new business model will emerge that are superior. They are more risk sensitive and better prepared. They are equally, if not better, in terms of returns, and they will actually be cheaper to run. Technology, again, I think is the key behind it. Portfolio construction and management of the future presumably will be done by AI.
That's so true, and we've seen a big evolution to that point. So let's talk a little bit about data. You know, from an investment perspective, there's so much data out there, and without the proper guides or rules and regulations, as we had mentioned before, whether it be in the EU or the United States or globally, in order to really get good results, there are a lot of different providers out there that provide data about, you know, how companies can report to on some of their sustainability initiatives. However, it seems every provider values it differently. So how does someone like myself that we invest in and that we want to see the total picture of the type of sustainability is what we have done with our portfolios, how do we measure that today?
Yeah, it's a learning curve, a very steep one though. It's true that there's a lot of inconsistency and lots of gaps. The MIT did a wonderful study not long ago called the aggregate confusion, in which they analyzed exactly the shortcomings, and they named why that is so. Many of the sustainability data and the rankings provided are backward looking. They're not, the coverage is imperfect, the historical track record is insufficient, and so forth. But situation is improving rapidly, because progress on the digital front, increasingly companies do not necessarily compete in beauty context with sustainability ratings, because the transaction costs are becoming very high. You have to comply with so many different questionnaires. And then the questionnaires usually are backward looking, but as an investor, you want to have a forward looking perspective. But the digitalization of the ESG data is making really, really rapid progress. So I'm quite optimistic that increasingly the data that is being provided is meaningful. It gives at least a first benchmark, which increasingly will be complemented, not only the raw data that comes from the corporates, but also from unstructured data that is useful in interpreting trends, and all that in real time, not just once a year, and then with a huge lag that actually makes it useless for current analysis. So I would say stay tuned, start to dig into it. It's not easy at this point, I agree. But there are increasingly hopeful signs on the horizon, and I have no doubt it's within a few months we will all get there. The situation is already much better than it was 3 years ago. When I helped, for example, in my old function, I helped a few global initiatives to get off the ground. One of them is called Global Reporting Initiative. Most corporates know about it, or I think 80% of Global 500 are using the GRI standards for measuring sustainability. They have kept pace with the changes, so things are going more and more digital, more and more real time. So I'm quite optimistic that this gap is being closed now. It's a learning curve. And it's part of the industry's desire to adapt to the changing framework conditions.
Do you think that that companies, they're at least hopefully some are, and maybe some are getting there, because we all know this is a journey and it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. But to that point, it seems that those companies that are public especially are very short-termism, I call it, in nature. You know, they focus on quarterly results instead of really focusing on the long term and getting the leaders to really look long term, to build out the businesses, you know, to have the proper governance structures. So how would you say, what would bridge that gap to really bring companies forward in that thinking?
I think you're absolutely right, and many people have written about it extensively. Short-termism is really undermining long-term value creation in certain instances, actually many instances. Many CEOs have often complained in the past that we would love to do more, invest into a more resilient, future-oriented, but our short-term shareholder demands don't allow us. Yes, it is a problem, the quarterly short-term. Ideally, we should have only an annual one, and then even that should be, I understand these systems can't be changed that easily. One way of bridging that is you cope with the short term by projecting the long term much more. And many corporations have learned that. When they report on their quarterly results, at the same time, they stress more the long-term dimensions behind their current efforts. So there's also opportunity in short-term sustainability investments. There's still a lot to be harvested in terms of efficiency gains, energy, and so forth, which you can package under the S, sustainability, resource efficiency, for example. So that's another trick, how you can package it. You can combine the long-term with the short-term. But in principle, it's a big dilemma. Yeah? Mark Carney, this great person, he gave really great speeches about the tragedy of the horizon. Yeah? And if anybody hasn't read that, I would recommend it. Some of these speeches go back to 2015. And it speaks to a basic dilemma of humanity, how we discount the future. And our ability to act today in the long-term interest is limited because of our behavioral biases and our flagging. So how do we overcome that when the short-term pressure by the market is there? We need to be creative. So coping the short-term, packaging the long-term, showing the benefits of the long-term in the short-term, more only the short-term, and stressing in the strategic narrative increasingly where the journey is going to. Increasingly, investors who have a long-term interest are paying more attention to that. And that is the educational impact that hopefully COVID-19 will also have. That yes, short-term is not unimportant, and we need to have that return for all sorts of reasons. But at the same time, we want to make sure our investment actually is profitable also in the future. So hopefully that will change.
Yeah. So how do you, now, what is the perspective when you relate it to private companies versus public? Is it's becoming more, are they behind the curve from public companies, or what is your thoughts on that?
It's a very mixed picture as it is with the public listed companies. Some are far more advanced because they can act in the long-term interest. Many family-owned companies have genuinely a long-term perspective on the investment decisions. Wonderful, wonderful, if well run and well governed. That is arguably a really big advantage of privately owned companies. But then, of course, you have also many companies who just exploit the short-term opportunities, and they do not really care about what will happen in 2 years or 5 years. So the picture is very mixed. One needs to look to it. ESG data is also increasingly looking into privately owned companies, which is a good thing, on governance, on environmental performance, on social performance. So hopefully that will shed more light on it. Very mixed picture, I would say. It would be wrong to argue better or worse. It's truly mixed, and it depends.
Right.
I personally have excellent experiences with privately owned companies. When the owners genuinely think ahead, they're truly willing to adjust to changing circumstances much faster than public listed companies who have to go through various processes. They need to pacify the quarterly interest, at the same time hedge the bets for the long term. And by the way, the remuneration of the CEO is tied to the current stock exchange, to the current stock valuation, and maybe the contract will not be renewed next year. So it's a mixed picture.
Right. So one last question that was just posed. You spoke about food being the next crisis. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I don't want to look into the dark crystal ball of the future. I have lived through civil war. I had malaria in some places. So misery can take many forms. Anybody has been to Lagos recently, or Calcutta, or Guayaquil in Ecuador, or Rio de Janeiro, and you are aware of the slums there and the huge conglomeration of people in a very narrow space with basically no infrastructure, no water, no provisions. You can easily imagine how a shortage of food and hunger can easily translate into mass panic and social unrest. Not difficult to imagine. Urbanization has progressed enormously. Lagos, for example, in Nigeria has now, I believe, 18 million people. And when you travel through Lagos from the center to the airport, you see miles of slums. And so it takes only a straw fire to ignite. So there's more volatility now, much more potential for disruption.
Yeah, and you know, there is a lot more volatility. As you were talking, you know, the Dow just plunged 1,600 points. So the volatility continues, I think, during this pandemic. George, thank you so much for your thoughts. We really appreciate it. Very incredible insights, something that I think we all can learn from and take forward in our daily lives. And now I wanted to turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Libby. Thank you so much, George. That was fantastic. And thank you to everybody out there who stayed on till the end of today's event, to the session today. Our next virtual session will be on Thursday, June 25th at 2 p.m. We have a great post-COVID asset. It's a 3 CIOs, and it's going to be post-COVID allocator discussion, and it'll be 3 big asset owners that's going to be moderated by Ian Sim, which we were very fortunate to get, the founder and CEO of Impacts Asset Management, and grateful for their help. So on that next call, please save the date, is Rodrigo Garcia, Illinois State Treasury, and Kirsty Jenkinson from CalSTRS, and Jeannie Shen from Gavi. Also, our next in-person event, which we're excited, is October 26th, 27th at the Angus Barn Pavilion in Raleigh, North Carolina. So registration will be sent to you and renewals within the next probably 2 weeks or sooner. And we realize some of you might not be ready to make a commitment to travel yet, but if you are ready to travel, you can drive there. We would love to have you in October. So that again is October 26th, 27th. And asset owners, please let us know if you want to take some of the last spots on the June 23rd, 2 p.m. asset owner discussions. We're keeping them to 8 to 10 people. And if you let us know, we'd love to include you with that. And George, thank you for doing this. You've been lovely to work with. Libby, thank you. We're pleased to have you. And it's so good to see your faces. And just thank you to our good friends at Arabesque as well. We really appreciate everything you've done for us. So stay well, everybody. Be safe. And we'll look forward to seeing you in person this October.